being humble enough to understand where my weaknesses are and understanding where I need to hire people who are better in those areas than me to fill in my weaknesses is the biggest unlock for sure that we've had. Again, that is about really changing identity of not having to be the person who does this or gets credit for that or this, but really understanding that we're going to be better off if someone else is doing that. And of course, being willing to share the credit and, delegate and elevate, hand this off so I can focus on something higher, as in more strategic, zooming out and being able to look at more of the big picture. It comes back to, from sports, teamwork, complementing each other, everyone having a role, delayed gratification, pushing through discomfort, right? It comes back to kind of all those lessons are still things that I lean on every day.
Welcome to the Mile 40 podcast. I'm your host, Bishoy Tadros, the author of Break Barriers and Audacious. And I invite you to join me as I engage with guests to discuss those bounce back moments that we encounter on our personal journeys. Mile 40 is a forum to learn about how athletes, professionals, and leaders of all backgrounds stare down moments in life where the only option is to rise up. The Mile 40 podcast strives to remind listeners that the comeback is always greater than the setback. Welcome back to the Mile 40 podcast. Thank you all for continuing to tune in. I really appreciate you all for your support, your reviews, your feedback. If you haven't already, please be sure to hit subscribe if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Check out the show notes, pick up a copy of Break Barriers and Audacious. I will sign it. I'll send it your way. Today's guest is Garrett Salpeter, known as the health engineer. Garrett combined his training in engineering and neuroscience to create NeuFit and the patented NEUBIE device. He trains doctors, therapists, and professional sports teams and universities in how to apply NeuFit with their patients and athletes, helping them use neuroscience to recover faster from injury and optimize performance. He's the best-selling author of the book, The NeuFit Method, and the host of the Undercurrent podcast. Garrett, thank you for joining me today.
Bishoy, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
First things first, did I pronounce your last name right?
Salpeter.
Salpeter. Oh, man. I should have asked, but all good. Thank you. Please forgive me on that one.
We're new friends. We have a good mutual friend, but we're recent connections here, so it's all good.
I appreciate the past. So a lot of things I want to dive in with you today. I really love what you're doing. And given the fact that I'm coming off an injury right now, I want to dive pretty deep into that. But let's start things from the beginning. I want to make sure the audience gets to know you a little bit and is familiar with some of your background. So where are you from?
I grew up in the Chicago area, splitting time between the western suburbs and the city when my parents split up when I was 9. So I was back and forth, but went to grade school and high school out in the western suburbs of Chicago. Got it.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I have one younger sister who is actually a professional musician, has a fascinating story, and really, really cool person.
Amazing. Talk to me a little bit about, what childhood was like, what was life like? You talk about your parents splitting up. Talk to me a little bit about any potential disruption, and any sort of side effects of that.
When I think back to childhood, the memories that really jump out at me are those of playing sports in the yard, or playing street hockey with neighbors. When my dad coached my baseball team, a lot of it really is sports related, and that certainly is a common thread throughout my life. And that's sort of ultimately what got me into the work that I'm doing now and all of that. So I loved sports growing up. I was a good student, and if I'm being totally honest, a lot of it was coming from a desire to sort of prove myself, probably more to my dad, getting grades in order to feel like I was worthy of love or worthy of, or valuable as a human, right? A little bit of that sort of thing. But I was a good student. Now, of course, I love learning, by following my curiosity and care about the content. And, back then, probably like many, students at that age, it was more about either, getting grades, or I was just kind of going through the motions, didn't really care that much about the material. But, thankfully had, supportive parents who were, encouraged me and and gave me the opportunities to play sports. And I eventually, I played several sports and eventually really came to love hockey. And I started playing when I was 9, and I wasn't. It took me a while to learn how to skate and all that. But I went to go see the Chicago Blackhawks play a few times and just really liked hockey, and then started playing and just fell in love. And that really became my thing, and really part of my identity. And again, part of where I derived a lot of my sense of self-esteem and self-worth and value as a human, which is a whole other topic of conversation. But I really, really dove into that. And so started sort of specializing in hockey when I was in junior high, and tried out for, club teams and travel teams, and continued to pursue that. And it was really the first thing in my life that I just cared so much about, that I really gave my all to. I just fully committed myself to it. So I learned so much along the way through that journey, and eventually went on and played some in college, and all just had some really amazing lessons and experiences, with that sport in particular.
Hockey culture is different than a lot of sports. And, I say this as someone who I personally did not play hockey. I had friends that played hockey, but one of the things that always kind of stood out to me in those dynamics was it was clear, like a hockey locker room is not like other sport locker rooms. And I was never able to really pinpoint, what it was about hockey culture that made it so different. But there was a certain level of passion and loyalty to the sport and to the culture, really, of hockey by the players that I had known. Educate us a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in the hockey world, especially because, to your point, you mentioned being 9 and being unsure you were going to skate. There's a lot of nuances to being good at hockey, between balance, skill, grace, and then, as you kind of get into the bigger leagues, strength. So talk to me a little bit about all that.
There's a lot to it, yes, athletically. And I think, Bishoy, you had a great insight there, that the culture is different in hockey. And I've thought a lot about that. I totally agree with you. I noticed that, being around athletes from all sports, there's something unique about the culture of hockey. And I've thought a lot about it. And the best explanation I can come to, upon years of reflection, is that, a lot of, basketball, football, baseball, they're also soccer, they're also team sports. But I think hockey takes being a team sport to an even greater level, because in basketball, for example, you have your starting 5, you may rotate maybe 2 or 3 bench players, but it's more superstar oriented. There's more of an opportunity for, one player to take over the game. Whereas hockey, you have 3 or 4 lines of players who cycle through, and no one player is playing more. If a player plays 20 minutes out of a 60-minute game, that's a lot. So it's much more dependent on the team than any one individual, even more than other team sports. And so I think there's an additional degree of humility and team first and that sort of dynamic embedded within the hockey culture that leads to, I think, a really special experience. So that's one of the things I really loved about it the most, was being part of a team and being part of that dynamic.
This is more a question for me. Would you say it's harder to become a superstar in the sport of hockey versus some other sports?
Oh gosh, it's hard. I mean, it's to become a superstar in any sport is probably harder. It might even be harder in golf, because you got to be in the top 20 players, whereas hockey, there's 30, and football and basketball and baseball, there's like 30 teams, and there's hundreds and hundreds of players in the top league, whereas in golf there's like 100 players total in the whole PGA field, right? So some of that. So I don't know. I mean, it's so difficult to become the top out of. Look at the percentage of people who play play in high school, and then who play in, it's the fraction of a percent go on and play in college, then a fraction of a percent of them go on and play in the pros, then a fraction of a percent of them in any of these major sports, then you go on and become a star. So it's, I don't know that I can necessarily comment on that. It is a different skill set, and it's usually tends to be people who, it's biased towards people who grew up more in northern climates and have different builds for hockey certainly than you would for the NBA and soccer, right? Or different builds than football players. So there's, I don't know. I don't know that I can make a statement on that question, but there's certainly interesting dynamics about stardom, and then about body types that help bias people towards success in certain areas.
Yeah, fair enough. No, it definitely has my mind thinking, and hockey too. I mean, I'm going to stick on it for a little bit. If you think about some of the lessons that you've learned on the ice, talk to me a little bit about where you're able to draw parallels between your hockey career and some life lessons. I'm kind of pointing at this because I do think it's a cool thing to kind of explore, because you don't really come across, like, I haven't really had any hockey players on the show. I've had a lot of athletes, I've had Olympians, I haven't had any hockey players come on. And as we've kind of already discussed, there's a difference in the way that hockey players move, especially in those high school, college years. And I'm interested in kind of digging into it a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about some of the correlating lessons that you've kind of picked up from the ice that you've brought to real life.
There's so many good ones, and some of them can also be learned or experienced in other sports, not necessarily unique to hockey, but there's certainly some big ones. I mean, one was, for me, learning what it was really like to give all of myself to something, to really go all in, in terms of not just showing up to practice, but in terms of training and getting to bed on time that night so I could wake up and do it again the next morning, and focusing on the nutrition. And certainly 20 plus years ago, we didn't even know as much then, or I didn't know as much then, as I do and as we collectively do now either. But some of those basics still, I knew even then, and fitting in other workouts and having time to recover in between and working on skills. And really, for me, it was also, I talked about how when I was in school, I was, doing it mostly for the grades. I didn't care as much about the material. For hockey, I felt so inspired that I actually started reading books on motor control, on adaptation, on speed and strength and power and mobility and conditioning, because I saw it as a means to an end, as a vehicle to help me achieve my goals of becoming a better hockey player. And so along the way, I sort of picked up, sort of as a nice side effect, I picked up this interest and developed a real passion for physiology and the human body and health and athletic performance. And that was a nice, really nice benefit of doing all this. And that's part of what launched me into my career path. So, that was certainly part of it. And then the ability to work with teammates towards a common goal, to be able to have the humility, I think is the right word, or the sense of one's position within the team, to know where I'm needed and most useful, I can contribute to where someone else can, whether it's penalty killing or power play, or whether it's I'm playing defense or I'm playing offense, or we need someone to play goalie, right? It's understanding that we can lean on everybody's strength and skills. Someone else might have a better shot, and so it might be my job to go into the corner and be more physical and get the puck out and pass it to them. And then they're going to be able to pick the top corner and score the goal. So being able to play to everyone's strengths, certainly that helps me a lot in leading a team and a business now. A lot of those lessons, and those, of course, are learned in, and most, or if not all, team sports. So there's that. And then I think hockey is a unique one, as you were alluding to. It's, there's a whole additional element of being on ice and having to balance and learning puck handling with this hockey stick was kind of unusual to implement. And so it relates a lot, I think, to me now, in terms of, I see business as being a composite set of skills that in the beginning, I need to have them as we grow. It's about, hiring for some of those skills, but, needing to have the skills of communication and writing and, the kind of composite skills that lead to being able to talk to prospective customers and make a sale. And then the skills of being able to, then communication again, being able to deliver services or products and being able to organize, being able to, organize content and training and logistics and, now lead a team and stuff like that. I learned a lot about leadership. There were years like in high school, I was the captain of my team. And, when I was a senior in college, had, just kind of a little more leadership in group and training and stuff like that. And, learn elements of that, of how to motivate and inspire others. And, reflecting on the times I felt most motivated and inspired too, and learning from that. So I think there's so many good lessons. And that's, part of the reasons that I love when my kids are involved in, in sports to any degree. I think another big one too, that, I talked about putting myself just fully committed into this, pursuit. I think one of the big things I learned is delayed gratification. It would take me a couple months in the off season of doing a program to increase my vertical jump by a few inches. It's not just one workout. It's not immediate gratification. And I would work on certain skills over the course of, a week or a month or a season, and start to see improvement and seeing that improvement over time. It's not immediate gratification, but it is very gratifying to see all that work and to know how much I put into something, and to finally see the fruits of that labor, months later. In some sense, the fruit is almost even sweeter than if you had just picked it right away. To actually see it develop over time, I think is very cool. So there's so many wonderful lessons for sure.
Talk to me about either an experience or a situation, mostly throughout, those high school, college years where hockey was, central to, who you were and what you were building of yourself, where you had to either navigate a difficult moment, or perhaps where you were unexpectedly humbled, whether it was by the sport or by, something going on during that time.
The first thing that jumps to mind is when I was in high school, my sophomore year, I got cut from the highest, travel team in the Chicago area that I tried out for, that I really wanted to make, that I saw it as my path to playing college hockey and maybe even beyond that. And so I just had so much emotionally invested in this. And when I got cut, I just was distraught. I felt it was, felt like mourning a loved one, or, it was just really, really terrible. And I was upset. And at the time, I think I didn't have the emotional maturity in some ways to really fully take responsibility. I think I would blame, it was politics, or they didn't like me, or this or that. And really, I just, I wasn't good enough. And I finally did get that memo enough to at least focus on what I could control. And so, after that happened, I started doing this regular training exercise where I had a bucket of 100 hockey pucks, like in a big Gatorade cooler. And I would dump them out and I would shoot them, and I counted pucks. And over the next several months, I shot 75,000 pucks in my driveway. And I think that's one of the big lessons of sports too, sort of segueing back into the previous topic, where I think one of the biggest lessons is, we can't control our opponent. We can only control what we do, how we show up, the effort we put in, the way we prepare, the way we execute, the effort level that we give in each moment during the game. And so that was a big lesson for me. I saw, also on the theme of delayed gratification, I saw how much my shot improved over that period of time. And that became one of my, eventually became one of my greatest strengths, where it had been only so before. And so I think that was a good lesson. But it was, it was really sad and humbling and really devastating at the time. And then also seeing how that inspired me and motivated me to give a level of effort and commit at an even greater level than I might not otherwise have done. I think that was pretty cool.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Middlebury College in Vermont. So it's a smaller school in New England, and Division III hockey. And so there, I sort of tried to think about the best combination of academics and sports. And it was good for Division III when I was there. And I ended up being mostly like a practice squad guy, even there. But, being there and being part of the program and everything was, again, a big part of my journey and very energizing and fun. And I continued to just put everything I could into developing that.
So, I mean, you had mentioned that through hockey, you were able to open your eyes to the world of, these various topics, your interest in physiology and learning more about, what we're capable of. When did that spark? Was that during college?
I actually had even started, I had a couple people that I worked with back when I was in high school, that were doing like strength and conditioning and talking to them and going and hanging out at these gyms and different things, and started reading some books that even in high school that sort of started. And then certainly in college, when I probably should have been studying for my history exam or something else, I'd be reading books on strength and conditioning and building my training programs and stuff like that. And so certainly in college it peaked. And, I was the guy who I would have, we'd have the ice would go in probably in October, and then the season would officially start November 1. But from October 1st or whenever the ice went down, I was the guy who would go and be there. The building's not even open except for one door, and I'd go there in the mornings and get an extra session in, and then I'd bring my agility ladder and do some plyometrics in the indoor field house, there. And then we'd have, a team skate in the afternoon, and I go back in the weight room afterwards and all that stuff. So I was really kind of experimenting with all this and building programs and doing, really doing my best to implement a lot of what I was learning along the way. I probably could have done a better job of, asking others for advice, but I was just sort of enamored with this idea of really wanting to learn all of it for myself.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's awesome. And, it's cool to apply it in real time, right? Like not after the fact and being able to try and test it as you're kind of living through it in real time is a really cool element to the narrative. So you're playing D3 practice squad, like you mentioned. So did you have an idea of what you wanted to do, or were you still figuring it out?
So I still sort of back of my mind had the dream of going on to play hockey, but I eventually came to the realization that I, wasn't going to be playing professionally. And even still at the end, of my time in college, that was a big kind of like a snake shedding its skin. It was a big, a big deal for me psychologically to sort of give up that identity.
Yeah.
And then I was a physics major. I was, just like I was really interested in how the body works in hockey. I still am enamored with how the world works. And I took a couple early physics classes, and one in high school, one in college. And I just loved even the basics of learning the force of gravity and speed of objects moving and the basics of electricity. I just really loved it. So I ended up being a physics major, and I was a pre-engineering student. And so I figured, okay, this hockey thing is fun, and I'm also going to be a good, responsible, professional mini adult, and I'm going to go to graduate school in engineering and get some sort of career as an engineer because I really like problem solving and that type of work. And so I figured, all right, I'll go. So I applied. My senior year, I applied to graduate schools in engineering. I got waitlisted at Stanford, so I didn't end up going there. I visited the University of Michigan. I visited the University of Texas, and I came to Texas. I just fell in love with Austin, so I ended up coming here for engineering school. And again, thinking I was going to, just be a good engineer and responsible decision-making adult, I entered engineering. So I was working in this program where I was building or experimenting with new materials for solar panels. So like people know solar panels. The sun comes down, hits them. A lot of people have them on the roof, and it turns solar panels into electricity. So I was trying to work on new materials that we could use for those solar panels that could essentially reduce the cost to make it more accessible and scalable to get more solar power in there. So I'm working on that, and in the background, I still have this huge passion for physiology in the body. And I had another experience that I'll share with you momentarily. Another experience with an injury in college where I had this amazing breakthrough in healing, and it sort of opened my eyes to some of what's possible. And so when I was in engineering school, I thought, okay, I do want some business experience. So as a side business, I'm going to sort of open up a clinic within a clinic. And so I networked in the sports medicine world. And then towards the end of my time of my engineering master's, I had connected with the guy who was the chiropractor for the University of Texas, the Longhorns football team. And he had a private practice here in town. So I rented a 120 square foot room, and I started actually working out of there. And the catalyst for that, and the reason I wanted to do that, is because towards the end of my time in college, I had a lot of injuries along the way also. And I was always really disappointed with the traditional physical therapy, the traditional orthopedic medicine, with those experiences that I had. And then I had this injury where I had some torn ligaments. I was told I was going to need surgery. And so I was bummed out. And I happened to meet, through a friend of a friend, a doctor who was using older versions of electrical stimulation, this special type of kind of more like a microcurrent analog electrical stimulation, and working with the nervous system using something called functional neurology, looking at how the nervous system responds to injury and how that supports or doesn't support the healing process. And working with this practitioner, I was able to heal my ligaments on their own and avoid surgery. And I was so happy and relieved as a hockey player. But as someone who's looking through this lens of having the interest in physiology and really having the engineering mindset, wanting to solve problems, to find something that actually made sense scientifically from first principles, it was such a huge contrast from the previous experiences I had in traditional physical therapy, traditional orthopedic medicine. It made so much sense, and it worked. And so that really lit a fire within me to just have this interest in that. I was already set to go to engineering school, but that was really on my mind of wanting to do that. And so as sort of a, quote unquote side business, I opened up a clinic using older versions of electrical stimulation, working with somebody else, and set out to help people like me, really, to help athletes, have the tools and strategies to recover faster from injuries, and really share that type of experience that I had with others, try to pay it forward. And then I eventually realized that I didn't necessarily want to be an engineer professionally. I wanted to be more of a health engineer. So a friend of mine gave me that nickname. But I ended up sort of realizing that I wanted to pivot and launched on this professional journey.
I love that. And it makes perfect sense. And it's really cool to hear you talk about it out loud, because throughout that juncture of life, right? Like there's usually a push and a pull around, like, what am I going to do to make a living? And what am I going to do to, at least think about what my purpose is and what I'm really meant to do and what I actually want to do. And to hear how that flowed, and I'm sure parts of it were not natural, but the way the story is told, it sounds like, it did naturally come about where you found the direction that you wanted to go in. And that's a cool thing, because a lot of people spend a lot of time struggling to get to that point. And I did want to ask, and I don't want to stay on it for too long, but was there, and you mentioned it briefly, but was there any sort of struggle as you determined you were going to walk away from sport, like hockey specifically? Or I don't even know if you actually did walk away, but like in terms of your career ending?
There was actually, first, that is a very good call out in terms of being able to find that overlap of where my interests can allow me to provide service to the world and make a living, right? That ikigai concept And I feel very fortunate to have found that in my early 20s. And that allowed me to, really put in my 10,000 hours, do this, really learn the field, and, allowed me to, now, I mean, it's crazy to think about, we're about the same age, late 30s, I'm about to turn 40, and to be doing this for almost 20 years, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to go so deep in this area because of that. So that's a good call out. And then, really giving up that identity as a hockey player, that was where I derived a lot of my sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And so giving that up was very difficult. I sort of, played in some adult leagues and stuff here, and there were some other guys who played college, or some who played pro and settled in Austin. And, so I sort of kept a little bit of that, kept the dream alive, or kept that competitive edge and drive alive for a period of time, but eventually, sort of realized it. And that was actually good preparation. Talk about the lessons learned from sports. That was good preparation for another time I had to really evolve my own sense of identity, where I had for several years been working then with, with people, with clients, with patients in our clinic here. And I had been getting these amazing outcomes, helping people feel better, so many times feeling substantially better in that first session, getting these home run outcomes, or helping people walk again and get out of wheelchairs. And I've been doing this amazing work. And that, of course, became the basis for NeuFit. And there was a period of time where, I just, again, derived so much of my sense of self-worth and self-esteem and identity and satisfaction and joy from being in there and having those interactions and doing that work and providing those opportunities and experiences for people. And so it was really difficult for me to get out of that. But I leaned back on the prior experience I had transitioning from, being a hockey player to being a professional in this other way. I sort of was able to lean on that experience to know that, yes, I can do this, and it's going to be okay, and it's going to be for the long-term greater good of our team and myself and all of that too. But I realized that, every hour I spend in here working with one person, that's blocking me from building a team where eventually, we could in that same hour be helping 10,000 people. If you look at all the practitioners who are using our technology around the country, or now even around the world. So that was something I really, really had to wrestle with as well. And that theme of being able to evolve and change one's identity, it doesn't get much more fundamental and sometimes more difficult than that.
Hey, Mile 40 fam. I get asked a lot about my training programs and how I set myself up for success to cross finish lines all over the world. Well, I'm going to let you in on a secret. Recovery is half the battle. And in order to get that recovery, I rely on clean sources of protein. That's why my go-to protein shake is Owen. Only what you need. I have one after every single workout. 100% vegan and plant-based. Owen's plant-based shakes use a multi-source protein blend of pea, pumpkin seed, and flax seeds to include all essential amino acids to promote optimal daily health. Uncompromised taste. Owen brings together the essential elements of advanced nutrition, amazingly clean ingredients, functional superiority, and uncompromised taste. Now go ahead, go to www.liveowen.com. That's spelled LIVEOWYN.com. Use code MILE40 for 20% off your next purchase. Only what you need. I want to ask, it sounds like you were incredibly locked in during this period in a good way. And as are a lot of people, like during, that period in your early, mid, even later 20s. On a personal front, was this, and for lack of a better word, because you had said identity a few times, but was this really where you identified yourself, was in this mission essentially? Or were you still figuring out like who you are as a person?
Yeah, I was very much, committed to and identified with this mission. I felt like this was my sense of purpose. I felt like it was more than a paycheck. It was interesting. One, kind of big part of my story along the way there. In my early or mid 20s, my then girlfriend, we eventually got married, but she and I got pregnant kind of early on in our relationship, and I was really scared, and there were thoughts of, hey, I have this engineering degree. I'm just running this clinic as a one-man shop, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to earn enough to support a family. And there were discussions of and thoughts, internally and for myself of, should I do something that's more responsible here financially so I can provide for my child? And, through that, there were certainly a lot of challenges and also many gifts from that experience. And one of the gifts was that it really helped me think and consider deeply and feel into what these different paths would be like. And I came to the very clear conclusion that I felt so strongly in my desire to continue to pursue this work that felt to me like more than just a paycheck, felt like a mission, felt like a purpose. And that if I gave it up, I'd end up resenting my child, my future child. And also a little bit of that, look, I know I'm adding value to the world. I know, even though, it's barely enough to afford an apartment right now, I know that at least I am making, some money doing this. I feel like there's enough of a signal here that I'm adding enough value to the world that there's something here that I'm going to continue doing this. And so it was a really strong kind of inflection point and reflection point to go inward and see that and examine, what I wanted to do and what was informing these choices. And so that was, I think I'm grateful I ended up making the choice. And that daughter is now, 14 and a freshman in high school. And, but yeah, that was an interesting powerful catalyst for really examining, decisions around my life direction.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And thank you for sharing that. And, that's real life, ultimately. And, um, um, you know, uh, and I'm sure you'll agree, like nothing changes you like fatherhood. Um, from the realization that you're going to become a father to when you meet your child. And in ways, it changes how you move from a business perspective as well. Every decision now has a whole new factor that comes into play. So, um, how old were you when she was born?
24 or 25. Let's see. 2011. I turned 25 a month after she was born. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. So you were 25 with a baby girl. And talk to me a little bit about, the initial, like that first year, that adjustment. Talk to me a little bit about how that went. Was there any sort of inner dialogue, any sort of, hey, like, am I doing the right thing? And kind of how you navigated that.
I sometimes think about that, and I do sometimes there's a part of me that wishes that, I was more where I am now in life when I had a child, because I feel like I was just had to work so much, and I still work a lot, but it's a little different now that I have a team and I have a little more autonomy. And then, when I was a one man shop, and I literally would have to take any session opportunity that I could get. And so I'd be in there working, 10 to 12 hours with clients, and I would kind of burn myself out. But I mean, I actually, I don't want to say that, because it didn't necessarily feel true at the time. I loved doing it, but I just, yeah, I mean, had such long and focused, clinic days. I didn't have a ton of energy left over on many days when I'd come home, but I also, uh, my daughter would come visit the clinic, and I'd hang out with her, and I'd take her for walks in the morning, and I'd, see her in the evening when I was there and all that. But I definitely felt a stronger sense of urgency to grow the business and be able to earn more earn more money to make sure that we could provide for our daughter there. So that definitely was a big motivator. Um, it was. I think there's pros and cons. Everything's a trade off. Everything's a trade off in life. Having a child at that age versus at 25 versus at 40 at different stages of life. There's pros and cons. I'm glad there's many blessings and positives to how it's worked out. It's interesting. They've sort of been on a lot of this journey with me. And my daughters, they always tell me like, "Gosh, Dad, you're like so much younger than all of our friends' parents." And I think sometimes a lot of them, they're sort of already a lot more established. I feel like my kids were sort of on the journey with me on the way up. I'm still, not that I'm at the peak and have made it by any means, but it just feels like it's a special thing that they were sort of in those early stages of developing our product and launching the next phase of the business, and sort of really they were in it for some of these early stages of really meaningful foundational development and growth of the business, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, no, that is really cool. And I mean, just listening to you and like, seeing your eyes light up around it and, being a dad myself, like I can relate. And like the truth of the matter is, regardless of when you have a child, they don't come with manuals. So it doesn't really matter, right? At the end of the day. So, and in my opinion, there's advantages to both, right? Like being younger, you're a little bit more, you got more energy. So, you can kind of keep up with them a little bit more. And no, it's really cool to, see how the two align, with the birth of your child and, essentially the inception of your future as it pertains to your career. And I think that's a good segue into what you're doing today. So talk to me a little bit about NeuFit, NEUBIE, and how we got here.
It's interesting that it really is a carrying forward or a continuation of that experience I had back when I was in college, where I experienced firsthand how this combination of using electrical stimulation to harness the power of electric fields and how that influences the body's healing ability. Because when we get injured, our bodies actually create electrical fields internally that move charges around and move cells around and guide and influence and control and regulate the healing and regenerative and rebuilding processes. And we can use external electric fields to help facilitate or accelerate or tap into that. And then, working with the nervous system. And so, it really is a continuation. I've just gone deeper and deeper and deeper into that in one form or fashion. And so, I had this clinic, and for 7 or 8 years, I was working with people and using older versions of electrical stimulation. And I kept seeing ways I wanted to improve with my engineering background, ways I wanted to improve upon the technology. And then I also, as I got more and more interested in the nervous system, as I kept seeing how using techniques to work more directly with the nervous system profoundly influenced in a positive way the healing process and outcomes and health and vitality and all these things. When I started to understand that, I actually went back again to the University of Texas for additional graduate school in neuroscience, focusing a lot more on motor control, how the nervous system signals actually control movement, pathways from the brain down to the body and vice versa, body back up to the brain, learning a lot about that in sometimes excruciating detail. So I had this background, and then eventually got to the point where I decided that, at one point I was just thinking I wanted to maybe expand and have a few more clinics that would do what I was doing there. And, that would sort of be the path. And then through a whole series of events, finally realized, what I really want to do is actually create my own device. So I never set out at the beginning, certainly, to, develop a device or, have a medical device company or anything like that. And then at some point that just sort of became like the realization. It's kind of a little bit of an epiphany of, hey, this is what I really feel called to do next, and what is sort of the natural progression and next step. And I'm sort of glad I didn't know how difficult, how expensive, how long it was going to take, all that stuff, setting out to develop the product there. But through different connections I had with clients, I met someone that did prototype design and had a client who was a patent attorney and helped me with getting some patents on some of the ideas that I had, and was able to do some creative financing with an eventual manufacturer and get some friends and family money, the convertible note financing, but bootstrap it really, and figure out all these ways to make it work, and eventually launch a product. And so we launched right at the end of 2017.
Okay.
Finally launched the device. So as we're sitting here recording this, it's 8 to 9 years ago.
Wow.
So we've had our product out now, and then have seen that grow from me and one or two people in the office packing devices, and me doing the first certification in our old clinic office in person, having 20 something people there in a crowded room and doing stuff on the whiteboard and having people practice on each other, to now having a full team of operations people and sales people and clinical support and education people, and compliance, and having a warehouse with devices and seeing it grow like that, and seeing the people around the country who are able to go do on-site trainings, or the education training we have online for people, and the number of I think we hit recently over 4,000 people certified. So it's physical therapists, athletic trainers, chiropractors, people like that certified in the NeuFit method, and the number of pro sports teams and athletes I've gotten to work with and stuff like that. It's just been so cool to see. And it's also, again, this theme of delayed gratification, right? It's taken a long time. Sometimes it feels like too long, but it's taken a long time to do that. And then, in some ways, looking back, it feels quick at the same. It's funny about how the perspective can change on time. But it's so cool to see the way that it's just sort of it's like brick by brick by brick by brick, just building it over time, and seeing how different pieces add together, and learning all the lessons along the way of especially how to hire people, and understanding that a team, as a team, just like in hockey, as a team, we can do much more as a business than I can as an individual.
The way you tell the story is so awesome, and just kind of hearing you talk about it, and the excitement about it. And there's a couple different ways I could go about this. I could ask you questions about the wearables market, because the timing in 2017, that was, if I can recall, that was like before like the Whoop came out, and people started using the Whoop, and obviously there was always different wearables. But I feel like specifically in the last, I want to say in the post-COVID area, there's just been such a huge surge in the wearables market. And I'm interested on, now that you've been in the market for a while, how you feel about your timing in 2017. Were you coming out at the right time? Were you slightly ahead of the curve? And how that has played a role in, your evolution as a company?
So, just to clarify for listeners, I'm certainly interested in wearables. I have a Whoop and stuff. So our product is more medical device treatment. It's a type of electrical stimulation. So it's more of a device that's usually in clinics. Some people have them at home. So a little different than the wearables. But in terms of health and consumer oriented technology and things like that, I think that the timing is good in that respect, in the sense that there's just generally culturally, there's an understanding that technology can be additive to what we're doing and can make things more efficient or more effective. And so when clinics, and counter to that, there's also, sometimes in physical therapy or chiropractic, a feeling that, I learned these techniques, all I want to use is my hands. I don't want to outsource my knowledge or my skills to a machine. So there's a little bit of tension there. And yet at the same time, even those people understand that they want, electronic health record systems, and they want to use technology to make their lives more efficient. They certainly have smartphones. And so, eventually they start to see, even the ones who were most resistant, they start to see that using this device here is an amplifier of their clinical skills. It doesn't replace it. It's not like you just get any high school kid off the street to just press a button and they do it. No, they still use their clinical skills. It just gives them a tool that allows them to amplify the effects and direct and target the effects into the nervous system, so they can make greater change much more quickly and more significantly. So there's that sort of thing. I do think, just generally speaking, the fact that more people, especially patients who have wearables and use smartphones, appreciate and feel enthusiastic to use what feels like next level technology when they go into practices. And so, a lot of times they're expecting it, and when they use it, they're excited about it. And it's sort of a big differentiator for clinics to be able to offer something like this that provides those wow moments for patients. And it's a big differentiator.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for specifying, by the way. I think that's a good call out. And now, kind of redirecting less so around the industry and more so around your role as the leader here. Talk to me about what it's been like for you at the helm of this period over the last 9 years. You had mentioned the adjustments you had to make, for instance, with regards to growing a team and with finding the right fits. But talk to me a little bit about some of the ups and downs of that journey.
Oh man, there's definitely a lot of.
I'm sure there's no shortage, but if anything sticks out,
many times in the same day, there's all these challenges along the way, from being threatened and bullied by bigger established competitors in the marketplace, to having all sorts of cash flow issues and sleepless nights around, are we going to make it, and all these things that are certainly not unique to my story, but a lot of entrepreneurs experience and are very stressful. There's a lot of those. One thing that really stands out in terms of this process is another version of kind of changing and evolving identity, where there was a time when the business is so small that I, as the founder, I'm taking the sales calls, sometimes even packing machines and stuff like that. And so the process of handing that off to other people and being able to trust that, even if on that day they can't do it better than me, one, I need to be able to train them. I need to learn to be more of a coach than a player. And two, I have to eventually understand, or I came to eventually understand that, in some cases they were better than me when they walked in the door at that thing, and that's great. In some cases they weren't, but it was my job to train them. And if they're able to focus on that thing, if they're able to take sales calls all day, every day, and focus on that while I'm doing something else, they're going to get better by virtue of being focused on that, doing that every day, repetition, learning, adaptation, evolution. They're going to eventually be far better than I would be if I'm just doing it here and there, and my attention is so diffused and diluted that I'm not able to focus on it and give it the same sense of effort that they can. And so really being able to learn those lessons. And then more recently, hiring for the first time in the history of our business a real bona fide number two. Like there's a system that some entrepreneurs will be familiar with called the EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System, as described in the book, called Traction. And there's this concept of having a visionary and an integrator, or a CEO and a COO. It's like the Steve Jobs and Wozniak, or Bill Gates and Paul Allen. You hear about these things a lot. And so for a while, it was sort of the buck stops with me kind of thing. And I don't say that in any other way to say that I probably held on to too much, authority and control, and therefore saw ways in which I became a bottleneck. And so, one of the biggest lessons and areas of growth in the last year plus was, for me, for the first time, hiring a real bona fide number two to be that, president or chief operating officer type person. And, he's been able to take on things that I'm not as good at, like helping to build and lead and train and motivate a sales team and help grow our business, and, do other things that just complement me, where if it was dependent on me to lead, we wouldn't be as good. And I would be the bottleneck. So I think that's really the biggest thing is, I learned this as someone who, did not get this right away and have the battle scars to show, but being humble enough to understand where my weaknesses are, and understanding where I need to hire people who are better in those areas than me to fill in my weaknesses, is the biggest unlock for sure that we've had, along the way. And, again, that is about really changing identity, of not having to be the person who does this or gets credit for that or this, but really understanding that we're going to be better off if someone else is doing that. And of course, being willing to share the credit. I'm, so grateful and happy with people on our team. That part actually became easier, but there's just a lot to that. And in that book, Traction, that I mentioned, they one of the terms that they have is delegate and elevate. Hand this off so I can focus on something higher, as in more strategic. Kind of zooming out and being able to look at more of the big picture stuff. So that's been, I think, one of the biggest lessons there. And it comes back to, from sports, teamwork, complementing each other, everyone having a role, delayed gratification, pushing through discomfort. Right, it comes back to kind of all those lessons are still things that I lean on every day.
I know your story is far from over, but I am interested, if you think back in particular over the last, 8-9 years, is there any moment that sticks out in particular as being, a real proud moment, something that, potentially reaching a pivotal, part of the journey that maybe you hadn't anticipated before?
There's a couple. There's so many. I've heard people describe entrepreneurship as a journey of just repeatedly getting punched in the face. Or Elon Musk has a quote about it being like eating glass. You just sort of repetitively have to deal with a bunch of shit, and then you have these moments. Like I've had some of these moments that stand out along the way where it's like, okay, wow, it's a sign that yes, it's worth it. Yes, it's working. Okay, it's worth continuing to go on. And so, there's been a couple times working with patients where I've seen, like one woman get out of a wheelchair, and walk again after 25 years of being paralyzed. I mean, there's something like that certainly engages and inspires me to keep going. And a couple other things that stand out. One is the first time we won or qualified for the Inc. 5000, Inc. 500 awards. That was like, okay, we're sort of established as a business. Another one was releasing my book, the NeuFit methods.
Oh.
As you know from your experience, Bishoy, it's a labor of love. A lot of effort goes in, at least in the pre-ChatGPT days. A lot of effort goes into writing a book. I think that because in order to not only did I feel good about getting it out, but I had to, in order to write the book, like I'd been writing it, working on it for a while. I finally had to get to a point inside of myself where I felt like, yes, I have enough of a story to tell and enough value to share that I think it is worth putting this out into the world. So I had to sort of get over my own internal resistance of, my voice isn't interesting enough, or I don't know enough, or this book wouldn't be enough, be valuable enough. I had to kind of get over. So there's a lot that goes into, releasing the book and then having it be well received and all that. And then being able to work with some really higher level people and athletes and, getting talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast, or getting to work with Saquon Barkley, the NFL player, and some other pro athletes and stuff. And like being able to connect with those people, it's just sort of like, it does feel very validating of like, hey, this is someone I look up to and I'm able to help them. I must be doing something right. Like I'm gonna, all those punches in the face and all those moments eating glass. I think it must be worth it, because at least directionally, we're doing something right here.
No, you definitely are. Look, you got a shout out on Joe Rogan, and now you're on mile 40. And
right.
I'll let you figure out later which one you're more proud of. You don't have to say it on this show. No, but that's awesome. That's really, really, really cool. I can't help but think, man, like in talking to you, I'm truly inspired by you, because the way that you move truly distinguishes you. And I think that you're very adaptable. And I think that, in this conversation really stands out to me with regards to how you handle things that might come your way. And whether they're personal, whether they're in sport, or whether, in the professional world. And in a way, I do believe that that's one of your secret weapons. And as a result of that, there's an abundance of questions I could ask you to kind of round this out. And I don't want to ask you like the typical question around, what have you learned about yourself over the last 9 years? But when I think about you as a father, as an entrepreneur, as an athlete, and as someone who has kind of had to power through in various areas of your life, what would you say is the value or the fundamental mantra or mindset that really carries and propels you through, deep down inside, when it comes to where you meet yourself? And especially in those moments where you're challenged and when your back is up against a wall, whether it be, early on in the company where bigger companies are looking down on you and trying to take you down, or having to navigate, the complexity of becoming a father at a young age, or, having to battle through a really competitive, field in the world of hockey. Where does the dog in you come out?
First of all, I want to say I really appreciate your comments there, about handling all this and being adaptable. And that means something coming from you, knowing what I know about your story and everything that you've been through in your life. And, it's sort of like it takes one to know one sort of thing. I know, what you've been through there, and you have a very inspiring story, as of course your listeners know. So, I appreciate that. And then, in terms of your question, I think mindset is a key piece of it. There's a fundamental, certainly growth versus fixed mindset. I certainly, I mentioned I read a lot about strength conditioning. I've also read a lot about psychology and personal development. And so, like the Growth Mindset book by Carol Dweck, who developed the term, is a great one. Yeah. So I think that's sort of a fundamental thing. My hockey coach in college taught us a lot about John Wooden, who was the famous UCLA basketball coach from the 60s and 70s. And then he had a lot of amazing content. He wrote some books. And so I read his book on leadership, a couple of his books. And one of the mindsets that has really helped me is his mindset, his sort of core fundamental teaching on what's the definition of success and competitive greatness, and how he talks about success isn't our external outcome. Success is the peace of mind that we have from knowing that we gave our absolute best and did the best of which we're capable in that moment. And so adopting some of that growth mindset of always being being inclined towards learning, and then having that John Wooden infused mindset and having that framework of really doing my best to run my own race. And I like many people, I do fall into that trap sometimes of comparing myself and feeling down on myself because I'm not doing as good as this person in that area, or because I'm not as attractive as that person or as successful as the other person. And I also, I think, especially in more recent years, have done a lot of work practicing meditation, learning mindfulness. I've gone to a couple retreats and learned from some teachers, and have actually a couple who have become personal friends. And so really understanding and being aware of what's driving me too. Is it that internal curiosity and sense of alignment and that energy and interest of wanting to pursue this? Or is it that ego driven, I'm doing this because of, the opinions of other people, or what I believe the expectations are of other people, or how I want to be seen by other people, and really getting clear on that. I think in more recent years, that framework has really served me a lot. So it's kind of a combination of those, mindfulness, growth mindset, understanding what success really is. A lot of the John Wooden teachings, those have been probably the three biggest influences on me, and sort of the core principles and concepts that I, coach myself to kind of go back to and think about on a, perhaps on a daily basis, or at least a very frequent basis.
I appreciate that, Garrett. And honestly, when I think about these episodes and, what people really walk away from, it's that core foundation. It's those principles. And the thing about everything we've heard now over the last hour is grounded in those principles. Because as you kept talking throughout this conversation, I kept thinking every step of the way, he wasn't leaving anything on the table. Like, he gave it his all every step of the way. And as a result of that, more doors continue to open and more opportunities continue to grow. And I think that's the beauty of what it is that you're building. And that's going to be one of my personal takeaways from this. So I just want to say thanks, man. Thanks for the time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for being raw, honest, and leaving it out there for us to kind of learn from you and to follow you. The last thing before we close out, please tell the audience where you want them to find you.
Yeah, happy to do that. I just want to thank you, Bishoy, because this is definitely one of the more interesting conversations. And I'm often educating people about neuroscience or physical medicine, and to really dive into some of this stuff. I certainly hope you, the listener, find value in some of this. I often have found a lot of inspiration and sense of support and help in dark times by hearing about others who have gone through similar circumstances and persevered and come out stronger and better on the other side. So hopefully there's something in that for you. And then yes, if you're interested in learning more about our work at NeuFit, best places to find us are on social media wise, Instagram, NeuFit RFP is our business page, NEU like neurological, FIT RFP for rehab, fitness, and performance. I have a personal page, Garrett Salpeter, just my name, 2 R's, 2 T's. And then our website is www.neu.fit, neu.fit.
Awesome. Garrett, thank you so much, man. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Bishoy. Yes, really enjoyed it. I appreciate you having me on.
You got it. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Mile 40 podcast, go ahead, subscribe, leave a review, and share the word. Thank you for being a part of the Mile 40 family. And let's unite in showing the world that comebacks are always greater than setbacks.